Hi everyone, it's Jeanette here from the Sewing Studio, and today I've been asked to share with you some top tips, and I thought I would do it around accurate piecing or more accurate piecing. Not everything we always do is perfectly accurate, and it shouldn't be because we're not machines. But it was interesting because the other day I came across some blocks that I started making, I would say about 8 years ago, and I'd cut them all out and I'd put them all in bags and had them ready to sew, and then obviously something else caught my attention. And they've sat there for 8 years. So I thought I would push on and carry on piecing them. And I was quite amazed at how different they were coming out, how much easier I was finding putting them together. They weren't necessarily complicated blocks, but it was quite a good measure of progress, if you like, of how my skill is increased, improved and developed, and some of the tips and techniques that I've picked up over the years that actually now means that I put those blocks together far more easily, and they were coming out more truer to size, and I was having far more enjoyment sewing them. So I thought, actually, we take this for granted sometimes, that all the time, every time we're sewing, we're increasing our confidence, we're increasing our skill level, and we're getting better and better all the time. Hopefully, doesn't always go to show, because sometimes we have bad days where we sew things wrong, and that's absolutely fine as well. But I thought one of the things I would do then is share some of the techniques and things that I've learned over those sort of 8 years, and in terms of, and my piecing wasn't bad to begin with 8 years ago, but actually I was noticeably improvement on that. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is accurate cutting. And before we even get to the cutting, one of the things I always do is press my fabric. So I've just grabbed this bit of fabric out of our scrap bin here, and you can see it's a bit sort of crumpled, and we've got sort of a line down the centre there. Now, if I went in immediately and started cutting that with my ruler, my shapes would not be accurate because I've got sort of creases in there. So the first thing I do to all my fabrics, with the exception of pre-cuts, is I press them with steam, if it's off a fat quarter or anything off the bolt. And the whole reason behind that is if there's going to be any shrinkage, I want that to happen now rather than later on in my block. So I steam press all my fabrics and they come out really flat. The only time I don't use steam, but I will still press them if they need it, is if it's a pre-cut, if it's a 10-inch square or a 5-inch square, one of the mini charm squares, or 2.5-inch strips or 1.5-inch strips, or anything else that's already been cut to a certain size. And the reason I don't use steam on them is because steam can shrink them, and I've done it before where I've had 5-inch squares left over and I've given them a steam press and they're no longer 5 inches. They tend to just shrink in one direction, and I think they came out at 5 inches by 4 7/8, but it meant that I couldn't get 4 2.5-inch squares, which is what I was looking for from them. Now, I could still use that fabric, but not for what it was intended for, so that little bit of shrinkage did happen there. So the first thing we're going to do is take that piece of fabric to the iron, and we're just going to give it a press. Now, I haven't got steam in this iron, so that's just a nice hot, dry iron. And now we're ready to cut. So that's the next bit about the accurate cutting. Now, first of all, rotary cutters, I always find much better results than if we're using scissors, but I know a lot of people that still do a lot of hand sewing and cut by scissors. And if I'm English paper piecing, the accuracy isn't so important because you get the accuracy from the paper in that, so I tend to cut that with scissors. But rotary cutter, nice sharp blade. If we've got to the point where the blade isn't going through the fabric very well and we're having to recut, we need to change the blades. And I know we're all guilty of it. We think, oh, well, we'll just keep going with it. And then we change the blade and think, why didn't we do that sooner? So a nice sharp blade. Also, one thing I will say about the blades, once they don't cut the fabrics well anymore, I downgrade them. I have a second rotary cutter that I use to cut wadding or batting. So even if it's not sharp enough to cut fabric, I find it still works really well on wadding. And actually I get a third use out, because then it gets downgraded again to a different rotary cutter, which I use to cut paper. So I get sort of 3 uses out my blade before it gets recycled. So cutting. Choose a ruler that makes sense to you. For many years, I had rulers that I couldn't actually read very well. I tend to use a lot of the Creative Grids now. We're not sponsored by Creative Grids. We do sell them here, but even before I worked here, I was buying Creative Grids ruler just because they don't slip. And I find the markings on them really clear, really easy to see. At the beginnings of my patchwork journey, I didn't have a Creative Grids long ruler. I had one that didn't have any grip on the back, and it was forever moving. It was forever sliding, and I was miscutting. So I upgraded, I changed to a creative grids, and I've never looked back, to be quite honest. That said, if you've got a ruler and you don't want to purchase a second one, you sometimes can get films and grips that you can put onto your ruler to help give it grip and to stop it moving around. But for me nowadays, any time I'm buying a new ruler, the first place I'll look is for a creative grids. Because I say that is genuinely what I use. So I'm going to fold my fabric in half because is going to give me my straight edge to begin my cutting. So if I was going to cut this down to, let's say, 2.5 inch strips, because you know how much I like 2.5 inch strips and squares. And then I have a finger off the ruler that acts as a buffer. And I've lined that folded edge with my straight line, and I'm just going to cut. And always start a little way back because that rotary cutter blade is on a curve, so it's not going to bite, it's not going to cut instantly. And nice even pressure all the way along. Now I see some people use like a weight or something at the edge of their long ruler, particularly if they're making a long cut to help stop the ruler moving. So if you find that works for you, absolutely do that. And then I can just flip that over and begin to cut my 2.5 inches. Now just the other thing to say, and I'm going to put this under the close-up, is that when you're actually making a cut with a ruler, you want to be making sure that the line is actually on the edge of the fabric. So I'm just going to not put it on. So if I put the ruler there, that 3.5 inch line is actually touching the edge of the fabric. Now I'd be undercutting by the width of that line if I was doing that. I actually want to position that. As I said, I was going to do 2.5, so let's move down to 2.5. So that black line needs to be sitting on top of the fabric. So for me, because I'm right-handed, my outside edge is on the very edge of that fabric. That's how I'll exaggerate it. If we were doing there, we'd be undercutting. So we want that line to be on the fabric, not slightly off it. Now for some things, if we're bag making or for some things that are quite small, that's not going to make much of a difference. But when we're working on a quilt, if you add up all the pieces we might cut over a large queen size, king size, even a baby quilt, that quite quickly adds up to quite a lot of fabric. So we're just going to hold that ruler down and then we're going to give it a cut. So recap, have your fabric nice and flat and use a ruler that makes sense. Now I will just very quickly just also talk about this, because this is another good ruler, and I'm going to open up my fabric. Because if you find that you do miscut and wander away a bit from the edge of the ruler, this is a really good one. One, because it holds the fabric down, because the hole, and it's a stripology, and you can get these in lots of different sizes. This is my ruler from home. I think I bought it here many, many years ago. That's probably too many minis, but I've had it for quite a while. To be honest, I don't always use it because I'm so used to using, I learnt on a long ruler, so that tends to be the one I grab for. But if I'm doing a lot of strip cutting, this one comes out. But I really like this because your blade can't wander off anywhere, and also the weight of the ruler itself keeps everything nice and flat. So I'm just going to start down here. That's my clean up cut right there. I think I might be cutting on the, yeah, that did cut. I think I might be cutting just on the edge of the two desks there. And if I was going to do a 2.5 inch strip there, and the blade is just following the line in the slit in the ruler. So that's a really good one as well for getting nice accurate cuts. But like I say, you sort of use what you have. Oh no, it didn't cut. I thought it missed a little bit there. But I can just go back in and cut that. I won't do that now, but I could have just carried on right along that strip doing 2.5 inches. But say I'm cutting on a crease in the two desks there. So get a nice accurate ruler, something that you can sort of hold down that doesn't move about too much on you, and something that you can read and read really easily. The next bit, and this is a lot of it about accuracy, 1/4 inch seams. Check your 1/4 inch seam. Sometimes 1/4 inch seam isn't a 1/4 inch seam, and how many times have we done that? I know on my big machine at home, I've got a 1/4 inch foot and a 1/4 inch setting, but if I do that, my blocks come out slightly small. And there's lots of reasons for that. My foot has got a bar, so over the years, that bar might have sort of moved a little bit. It might be the thickness of the fabric. It might be the thickness of the thread that I'm using. It may be my pressing technique. I might not be pressing it, but if I measured it, if I sewed a 1/4 inch seam and measured it, it would measure 1/4 inch. But when I open those squares out, then they don't come to the right size. It's not allowing for the fold in the fabric. So the way I check my 1/4 inch, I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam there. I've pressed that open, and you need to press that open. So these were 2.5 inch squares. And what I'm going to do is get my little ruler, because if I sew 2.5 inch squares together, that should now measure 4.5 inches. So once I've sewn my seam and pressed my fabric back, I'm going to measure it, and that should come to 4.5, and that one does. So that's a really simple way to check whether or not your 1/4 inch seam is truly a 1/4 inch seam when it comes to actually putting the units together in a block. Now, if that seam wasn't, if that was slightly under, then I've got to narrow my seam a little bit. If it's bigger than the 4.5 inches, I've got to widen my seam a little bit. And on most machines, and I'm saying most because there are some machines, I mean this machine here, for example, it doesn't work quite like that, but you can nudge your needle normally by one route. Mostly you can nudge it by changing the width stitch settings. And on a straight stitch, it will move the needle either to the left or the right, depending on which way you're either narrowing or widening your zigzag. So at home, I know that when I put my 1/4 inch setting in, I've just got to nudge my needle 2 or 3 times to take it to the point where it gives me my exact 1/4 inch once my fabrics have been sort of pressed open. My tip number 3 is to pin or not to pin. As many of you see me sewing here, this is exactly how I sew at home. I don't use a lot of pins. I always sort of think I use pins where I need to, but it's not. Some people like to pin all the way along a seam they're sewing, but I tend not to. But this is, once again, personal preference. I find that if I use pins, I get a bit too blasé. I was thinking, oh, that seam's in the right place because I've pinned it. And then I look at it and find that actually sometimes that has moved, or sometimes as you're taking the pin out, the fabric can move on you. So I tend to use pins to sort of hold, but then I like to sort of check as I'm getting to a match point, I like to check that it's exactly where I need it to be. Now, on really complicated blocks where I've had to have something that needs to be really precise in the centre, I have been known to use a little dab of the glue pen, but just a little bit, just to glue either side of the seam to make sure that that match point doesn't move. So that's sort of in drastic situations, but I sort of feel I pin where I need to pin rather than using lots of pins. Pin can distort things, and particularly when you take the pins out, they can move things. And like I say, I find I'm a bit more focused and I concentrate a bit more if I don't use pins, because then I check my match points as I'm going, and I find I get a better result that way. But like I say, you do you. If you get a better result with pins, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. The next thing I would say is checking the block sizes. And this is probably one of the biggest improvements I've made over the years, is that I don't automatically assume that because I've used a 1/4 inch and put everything together that my blocks are going to come out the right size. So I do check blocks as I go along. I will measure them. If something needs to come out at 6.5, I will measure it. Has that come out at 6.5? And if it hasn't, if it's too big, don't be tempted just to trim, because if there's points on stars or whatever, you might have trimmed away your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So have a look to see if you can figure out why your block hasn't come out at the size it ought to be. They don't always have to be perfect, but they have to be sort of close enough. What you'll tend to find is, or what I've found certainly over the years, is if as soon as you start adding fudge elements into your quilts, that error multiplies and multiplies and multiplies and multiplies, and it eventually gives you such a headache that things may not join properly. It's not a pleasure to sew. So check as you go. Just make sure you just keep checking yourself and seeing that things are coming out the right size and that they're fitting together nicely. And then my final thing that I always do, and I've probably said it quite a few times as I'm doing things here, is I always make a prototype block. If I'm doing something new, if I'm trying a block, either something I haven't sewn before or something I haven't sewn for a long time, I will make a prototype just to see, because the amount of workshops, I was saying, if I have sort of £1 or £5 for every time that somebody said, if I did that again, I would do it differently. So make a prototype. I always do it, just trial out the blocks, get your scrap fabric out, because you will learn from putting that blocks together. Actually, if I did that, I would get a better result. That's a point I need to watch when I come to do it. So you learn lots by just doing that first prototype block. So they would be my top tips. They're sort of things that I've learnt and I've brought into my sewing that has improved my sewing no end, I would say, over the recent years. But I will end by saying the final thing to remember is at the end of the day, there's no such thing as perfect. Remember to have fun, remember to enjoy it. These are all things that we do to make our sewing journey more enjoyable and easier. But actually, if something hasn't lined up exactly, if you've got a little bit of a tip missing from a start point, don't stress about it. At the end of the day, this is sewing, and it's sewing that we do because we want to make things that we love for other people and for ourselves, to decorate our homes, to keep people warm. So always bear that in mind. I mean, I always think part of the charm of some of the old quilts is they aren't perfect. They have got mistakes in. There is a bit of fabric that's been added in right at the end because they didn't have enough. And that's part of their charm, and it's what makes them unique. So remember to just have fun with it as well. So I hope that's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you again here in the sewing studio.